We began by talking about compassion, about other people mattering to us. And what we did in the last lecture is we looked at empathy, putting yourself in another person's shoes. And we explored the extent to which empathy could drive compassion and can drive morality more generally. And I actually think any complete theory of our moral lives has to draw upon empathy, has to draw upon this putting yourself in another's shoes. But I also think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think that there are limits to empathy. There are limits to empathy which make it unreliable and untenable as a source for morality. To put it differently, to the extent we're good people and we live good and moral lives, sometimes we will rely on empathy, but sometimes we'll reject empathy. So why would we want to do that? Well, one thing is empathy is biased. We feel a lot more affection, a lot more empathy for a kitten than for a piglet. We feel a lot more empathy for a panda than for a chicken. This is not because of a deep reasoned moral argument about suffering and pain and intelligence and feelings. It's because some things are adorable. Some things trigger our emotions. But part of what it is to be a moral person is sometimes overriding the fact that we feel warmly towards this but not that, and ask ourselves deeper questions having to do with suffering and pain. Maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think we should rescue the kitten no matter what. But what about people? So I don't think there are many people who will defend this, which is that in the courtroom, juries are particularly biased in favor of defendants who are physically attractive and who are baby-faced. Because our emotional response to attractiveness and baby-facedness, the looks of youth, is innocence and sweetness and compassion. But surely somebody who's ugly and kind of grizzled deserves just as fair treatment. So it seems like an unfair world in which a young Leonardo DiCaprio would be acquitted of any crime because of how his face resonates to us. More generally, I think part of what goes on when we make a correct moral decision involves overriding our empathetic feelings. And in some cases, it's pretty clear that empathy could drive us not just to the incorrect choice, but actually to a straight-out immoral act. In part because it could pull our attention towards the one and away from the many. So remember the study I told you about before saying that we would care more about one person than about 5 people, particularly one person if we could see that person. But that's crazy. That's morally crazy. We shouldn't be swayed. Everyone has a face. Everybody has a name. Providing a name and a face sways us, but that's not the way it should work. If you think for a minute that the way to be a good person is to try to help the most people, then empathy will often lead you astray. And actually, one of the studies by Dan Batson illustrates this. So remember, we talked about his study where there's a girl and she's waiting in line for an operation. And if you take her perspective, you'll move her up the line. But as Batson points out, nobody thinks it's the right thing to move her up the line. Nobody thinks, say, for a list of people waiting in line for a heart transplant, you should walk and look at all of them, and whoever inspires your feelings the most, you should give them the heart transplant first. That's not right. It's not right because what inspires your feelings has to do with things like attractiveness and baby-facedness, and whether the person's the same color as you, whether the person's the same background as you. What you want to do to have a moral system is you have a system that doesn't take certain things into account, that is based on reason and not gut feelings. Now, these are examples where empathy is biased and empathy could lead you astray. But there's also another argument, which is that for a lot of what's core to our morality, empathy is not enough. Empathy is limited. And I'll give you a few examples of this. One example is sort of, is kind of particular, but I think it's telling. It is something pointed out by William James. So James talks about our relationships with our dogs. Many people have dogs as pets. They feel very affectionate towards them. They love them, and they care about them. But James points out, this is not a relationship that's founded on empathy. If my dog, I don't know whether my dog ever tries to take my perspective. Here's me and my dog. I don't know if she ever tries to take my perspective, but I don't think she does. And if she does, I don't think she would have any understanding what I do all day, which is mostly sit in front of a computer and go like this. And I don't really take her perspective very much either, because her life is a mystery to me. She seems to spend all of her voluntary time sniffing at disgusting things and trying to eat disgusting things, and it's just strange. And yet, I care a lot for her, and I like to think she cares a lot for me. And James's point is that you would have personal relationships founded on love and compassion without empathy. Consider again, as maybe a more salient example, one's relationship with one's baby. Soon, empathy emerges and there's a synchrony and so on. But from the get-go, there's none of that. But still, there could be an enormous amount of love. A lot of the sort of personal ideals that matter to us most don't have as much to do with empathy as one might first think. Now, empathy is particularly weak when it comes to our finest moral ideals, when it comes to more general policy, and particularly when it comes to our treatment of strangers. And some of the weaknesses of empathy are nicely summarized by Steven Pinker in his wonderful book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which we'll talk about later on in the class. So Pinker writes, "I can't say that it's empathy that prevents me from taking out contracts on my critics, getting into fistfights over parking spaces, or threatening my wife when she points out I've done something silly. My mind doesn't stop and ponder what it would be like to be the victims of these kind of violence and then recoil after feeling the victim's pain. Rather, my mind never goes in those directions in the first place." Pinker goes on to say that, the Old Testament says you should love thy neighbor. The New Testament says you should love thy enemy. But frankly, he doesn't love either one of them. He loves the people he loves, but most of the world, his neighbors, his enemies and so on, he doesn't love them at all. And I don't love most of my neighbors and my enemies either. But we are moral towards them. We don't kill them. In some situations, we will help them. We will sacrifice to help them. And this shows that feelings have their limits, that sometimes our morality is grounded not in gut feelings, but in moral principles. And the importance of moral principles, the importance of moral reason, and the limits of gut feelings are actually nicely illustrated in a story told by Adam Smith. And I'm going to present his story. I'm going to modify it slightly for a more modern age. Imagine you learn about the death of thousands of strangers. Imagine you learn it. I mean, Smith wrote in the 1700s, but imagine you yourself learn it. You open up your computer, you put on your computer browser, and out come some news stories. And one of the news stories is, in a country that you don't belong to, India, Argentina, United States, Australia, someplace you don't know about, someplace that is not where you are. Thousands of people died. They died of a salmonella epidemic. They died of an earthquake. They died of a factory fire. How would you respond? Well, this actually isn't so strange to you, because if you open up your browser every day, thousands of people often die. So how do you respond? Well, I bet you say, oh, well, that's too bad. That's unfortunate. And you go about your business. And Adam Smith says that when exposed to the death of thousands of strangers, we will remark our disapproval or say, oh, what a terrible world. And then we'll go on our life. And that night we will sleep with the most profound serenity. Now, imagine something different. Imagine instead you were to learn that tomorrow you're going to lose your little finger. So this is Smith's example, that tomorrow they're going to chop off your little finger. You would say, wow. You would say, that's terrible. That's how am I going to have anesthesia? Which finger? How are they going to, why? What? And that night you would not sleep a wink. So plainly, from a gut feeling, from an emotional response, the loss of your little finger matters more than the death of thousands of strangers. So this raises a question then. And the question Smith says, since it matters so much more, this loss of a finger, than the death of thousands of strangers, would it follow that someone would sacrifice thousands of lives to save his little finger? And Smith writes, human nature startles with horror at the thought. So his answer is no. Nobody would do that. Look, I'll even change the example. If you're extremely fond of your little finger, maybe you would do that. I'll change the example. You discover that thousands of people are going to die. You say, oh, how sad, have died, how sad. But also you notice your computer is slow. Your browser is slow. It's very frustrating. It's slow, it's unreliable, maybe your connection is fading in and out. It does not seem implausible, in fact it seems true, that that slow connection is going to bother you a lot more than learning about the death of thousands of people. But still, if you were offered then to speed up your connection, but thousands of people would die, you would say, that's insane. So here's the question then, and this is a question asked by Adam Smith. When our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish, how comes it that our active principles should often be so generous and so noble? And Smith continues, it is reason, principle, conscience. This calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this last phrase sums up morality. What a sophisticated morality is goes beyond gut feelings and selfish urges and desires to help people, but it also includes an understanding that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And what you see in moral systems all around the world, from religion, from philosophy, is an appreciation that a moral code doesn't care about you as special. A moral code says, you're not special. It says that we have to figure out how to live our lives such in a way that would somehow apply to everybody. So this shows up in all of the versions of the Golden Rule, in all of Confucian's statements about impartiality. It shows up in the consequentialism that we talked about, where the right way to live is to try to increase the overall amount of pleasure and decrease the overall amount of pain. It shows up in Kant's categorical imperative, where you should have a principle that applies to everybody that would make the world better all around. It applies to theories like John Rawls's veil of ignorance, or Adam Smith's own impartial spectator. Now, it might sound like this is some sort of technical idea that only gurus and great intellects could think about, but in some sense, this is a common sense that's accessible to all of us. We can all appreciate that the right thing to do is often not by appealing to our gut and appealing to our immediate feelings and prejudices, but also to take the bigger view. And my favorite summary of this is from Rick Blaine, the character played by Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. And so the movie ends, sort of spoiler alert, because I'm going to show you a clip. The movie ends with him talking about a sacrifice he must make, he and his lover must make, and why they must make it.
We'll always have Paris. We didn't have, we lost it until you came to Casablanca. We got it back last night.
When I said I would never leave you.
And you never will. But I've got a job to do too. Where I'm going, you can't follow. What I've got to do, you can't be any part of. Ilsa, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world.
That is an astonishingly rich philosophical statement. And the fact that we could understand it, that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans compared to everything else that's going on, shows that we're moral creatures. And making this sort of argument and extending this sort of argument back and forth to each other is an example of how reason could play a role in our moral lives. So I started off in the last week talking about the power of gut feelings, the power of emotions in morality, providing demonstration after demonstration after demonstration of how emotion shapes our moral reasoning and our moral action. I think all of that's true. But now we're starting to encounter the power of reason. The power of reason that says that, yeah, I know I favor this over that. I know I'm empathetic towards this rather than that. I know my selfish desires go for this rather than that. But I recognize that it's wrong. I recognize that there are higher moral principles at work. There are higher moral principles at stake. I may be happier if I saved my little finger and 1,000 people would die, but I know that that's wrong. I know that that's wrong because I know the people, the 1,000 other people are sons and fathers and mothers and daughters just as much as I am and the people I love are. And an appreciation of both the power of the emotions and the power of reason and rationality leads us to, I think, a more sophisticated understanding of what goes on in our moral lives. And I think now focusing on the interplay of emotion and reason makes moral psychology a lot more interesting.